And now we're recording. Hey, look at that.
Yay!
Yay. So welcome to you and to everyone. I'm your favorite Uncle Jer. And I'm doing this because I am so sick and tired of all of this shit online that is sound bites and clips, and God, I just think you can waste a whole lot of fucking time listening to stupid shit from stupid people. So I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking to people that I think are bright, that have some ideas that I've heard speak, and yeah, I've always thought that the best time during any sort of conference or anything was after, when people are talking, and it's not that scripted monologue session. It's just two people having a chat. So I thought today I would invite the lovely and talented Dr. Lauren Florco of Triple Threat Consulting to come chat with me. I think you're going to have to speak for that to work. But the reason she's here is because obviously in the midst of this global pandemic, we've also got all of this racial tension that has been boiling under the surface, coming up to the surface. And one of the things that I thought was really interesting is the effect of social media and body cams and all of that stuff that wasn't there 50 years ago when this was boiling up. So we're going to talk about that today. But first, I just kind of want to get to know you. I mean, I've seen you speak at things. You are a psychologist, but you do organizational psychology. And so tell me about you.
Sure. My background is, as you said, organizational psychology. So I've done some work on my own, some work in organizations, including diversity, inclusion, and some research around bias against different groups, equity-seeking groups in kind of with testing. But I mean, obviously, I'm still just a white female from upper middle class suburbia, so can't really speak to experience, but I can speak to, working with groups and kind of the academic side of things.
Well, so where do you come from? Like, where are you from?
I was born in Edmonton and then moved to Langley, so suburb of Vancouver, and then moved to Vancouver when I started going to school. But then I've moved all over the country as well for school and research at different points. So I've lived in Ottawa and Halifax, back to Edmonton for a while, but always make my way back to Vancouver.
So you've seen a bunch of different communities across Canada. And Halifax, I mean, if I'm correct, Halifax has a pretty vibrant Black community there.
Yeah, it really does. And there's lots of really interesting history with Africaville and a lot of the, even just, I can't remember, Pier 21, I believe the name of it is just, it's our Ellis Island of all the people coming through Halifax as well.
Wow.
Yeah.
And
but
then
still very predominantly Celtic culture there.
Oh, okay. Well, I mean, but that's the whole Maritimes, isn't it? I mean, they never really lost the accent.
No, there's a strong Celtic kind of piece, and then there's that strong like Acadian culture as well.
Yeah. Well, there you go. Now, what are we drinking today?
We are drinking Sauvignon Blanc.
Okay. I, of course, am drinking Corona, the only beer to drink during a global pandemic. And Edmonton, because you spent some time there.
Yep.
That has, I mean, I've been to Edmonton, and that neck of the woods has some pretty glaring, racial dichotomies.
Yeah, there's, I worked with a First Nations circle there for a while, and it's one of the biggest urban populations of Indigenous people outside of Winnipeg. So there's a huge piece of that. So, but there's also a huge disconnect in that as well.
Yeah. So, and by the way, I'm calling you from Langley. Yeah, this is where I hang my hat. So it's, what school did you go to?
I grew up in Walnut Grove.
There we go. Well, I'm in Walnut Grove right now. And
wow.
Yeah. So actually I've got two kids graduating from Walnut Grove Secondary. tomorrow morning, and because of the pandemic, I get to put the tassel over the cap, and give them their diploma. So it's I'll give a shout out to your, because it's the Gators.
Gators. Oh yeah, Gators, Gators, Gators. Chomp, chomp, chomp. It's really inventive.
Yeah. Well, it's I'll pour one out for you.
Yeah, my brother still lives out there as well. Well, half of the year because he coaches baseball in the States the other half of the year.
Okay, that's cool.
Mm-hmm.
Well, good on you.
Mm-hmm.
So, before we get too deep into it, what is it with white people?
Well, obviously I can't speak on behalf of all of them, but
Oh, come on, they make me speak about First Nations people
yeah,
all the
it's
time.
true. I would say particularly Canadian white people are we grew up in this culture of we're multicultural and we're not the melting pot, we're the mosaic, and so our identity is that we are not racist.
How's that working?
I think people are getting a rude awakening now, but not so much. Like, you still see it in the news, right? Where they're like, okay, well, what's happening in the States? But it's not happening here. And it's, I think people don't want to face that, that cognitive dissonance that, this is what we experience is not the same as what they experience.
And because in my experience, and I mean, obviously, I'm the white sheep of my family. I've spent time on reserve, but I mean, my dad was the white one. He was never around. So I grew up around the indigenous side of my family, and we're First Nations.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I mean, to us, there was never a question of racism in Canada. There was never a question of, people wanting to help you shop or questioning whether you could afford that. We were always taught, don't talk to cops and don't talk to social workers, but really don't talk to social workers.
Mm-hmm.
And if I'm being honest, I mean, I'm probably, as an indigenous person, I'm probably more afraid of social workers than I am of cops. But I know that you don't talk back to cops. I know that you put your hands on the wheel, you move very slowly, and like, I got stopped a couple of years ago, Christmas, and I was driving a Durango, and apparently there was one in the neighborhood, so they like flagged me, but it was toss the keys out the window, and I mean, dude, I look white, but
right.
Still, it's that sense of fear, that sense of impending doom. That it's just, that was all we grew up. How was that not visible?
Yeah, I think unless people are living in downtown cores of cities, they don't necessarily experience or see it, right? And even still, I live in Chinatown, so it's very apparent for me to see differences in how people are treated versus someone who lives in Mount Pleasant doesn't necessarily see that day to day, right?
Yeah.
You have to, and that's a big thing, is that you have to purposely expose yourself to it. Like, you have to read the novels, or you have to watch the stories, or you have to, actually interact with people to even see it.
Now, is that partly because we think we're nice people? Because I think that people have the idea that, if you're a nice person, you can't be racist.
Oh yeah, 100. I think that's a big piece, right? If you, or if it's predominantly a Christian culture, so if people think, Christians are always nice to everyone, they can't feel that. You don't see that cognitive dissonance where you're actually seeing your behavior is different.
And you used a big word, and I want to make sure that people get it, because we're going to be talking, hopefully, some younger people. So when you say cognitive dissonance, what do you mean by that? Like, explain cognitive dissonance.
Yeah. So cognitive dissonance means that you have an attitude and you have a behavior and they do not match. So a really simple way to think of that is that I know that smoking will kill me, but I continue to smoke, right? So you hold one attitude, but you have a different behavior. So this comes across all the time in terms of, people don't want, people say I'm a nice person, so clearly my behavior can't be racist.
Mm, okay. And so, but I mean, how to pick, because we look at pictures of Jesus all the time, and in the pictures he's white.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not the sharpest knife in the drawer, but I've seen pictures of people who are indigenous to that area of the world.
Hmm.
They don't look white.
No.
Did they like import some, German guy down there, or
Hmm.
British guy? Like what,
Yeah.
what happened?
A Jewish man from the Middle East. He's definitely not white.
Yeah. So is that just part of, you know, cr- people creating a narrative? Are they doing stuff because in order for it to make sense to me, it has to look like me?
Well, there's a bit of, you know, if we kind of go back and we think of, how tribes originally evolved, it was you had a small, really small in group, and it was more safe that you keep your in group safe compared to your out group. And so your brain would recognize and listen to things more if things looked similar to you or was genetically similar to you. But over time, that in group has shifted, right? So it got to a point where, you know, you could have been, I could be British, and anybody who's British is now my in group. Or I could be, oh, I'm from North America, so now Canadians and Americans are part of my in group. And that's expanded, but that doesn't mean that our mental in group has expanded, but there's still, our brain hasn't fully shifted that. Or if you have grown up where you've been told your in group doesn't include different races, then you create that as well.
Okay. So I want to skip to the side a little bit, and just because I know that there's a real debate, between, especially with cop stuff, and I think that it would be
Mm.
equally transposed to government, social workers, correctional facilities, healthcare to a certain extent, where you've got people saying that there can't be societal racism. And I think that people don't understand the difference
Mm.
between a person being a racist or
Right.
having racist tendencies. And I'm not really sure there's much of a difference. Um, but I think everybody's a racist when they're driving. And so, to me, I can understand why a person wouldn't think they were racist, even if they held racist views. My
Mhm.
dad's mom was this really, actually, you know what? She was a lovely German woman. She really, really
Mhm.
was, and I loved her to death. She was the grandparent that loved me. But she called Tiger Woods that nice colored golfer,
Mhm.
back in 1999.
Mhm.
And so some of those social things that
Mhm.
she grew up with that were part of that, probably what we're considering, systemic racism or societal
Mhm.
racism, that probably is indicative of that. So what's the difference?
Yeah. Well, I think a piece of that too is because we apply laws that we interpret today, or we apply different policies today with our non-racist viewpoint, even though they were created at a point where people were way more racist. So we think that how we're applying something today isn't racist, but it was created in a time where that law was created because of racism, or with racist views in mind, right? So um, there's a piece of that where it's so systemic that people don't necessarily even realize that that's kind of the breadcrumbs that got us here.
So would an example of that be stuff like drug policy, or
Yeah, the like even racial profiling is very like more recent, but like there was even things like um even just the right to vote for First Nations, Inuit, um wasn't until like the 60s.
yeah, my mom wasn't a person until 1960.
Right.
The oldest person on my reserve has only been a person 12 years longer than I have.
Right.
And it's funny because even then, I mean, that would seem to be a pretty glaring, uh, you know,
Obvious
illustration
one.
of, you know, racism at a systemic level by omission. We talk about the suffragette movement. We talk
Right.
about women's suffrage in Canada and voting rights. And that was, I think, what, 1928 or 19 something around there. But you had to be a person to vote.
Right.
And if you weren't a person, it didn't matter what gender you
Right. Well, and that was the interesting thing is if you read all the old laws of um, around giving Black people to vote in the US, and there was the 3/5 rule, right? Where they were like, well, Black people can't vote because they're property, but my house, but then they're like, oh, but we'll give them 3/4 of the right because they're not so much property that they're the same as a house. So it was a really interesting halfway racist, overt racist, I should say, of their thinking. But if you go back to when you're talking about what does systemic kind of look like today, right? You see this in the States where in the civil rights they passed, I'm speaking to organizational psych because that's what I know, they passed a law that while you administer a test to someone, whoever is the highest ranking on that test, that's the person that gets the job. So we're not looking at color, we're not looking at gender, just whoever's the top, because that's what us not discriminating. But they're not looking at who developed that test, why was it developed, what kind of what does the actual items look like behind the test that you can actually get to. And that was part of some of the research that I was doing was, you know, do these tests discriminate? And there were tons of tests like that, where there was an intelligence test that asked you, what does RSVP stand for? And unless you're a person that either knows French or you go to fancy parties all the time, no one's getting that answer right.
Mm-hmm. That's crazy.
So,
Now, that was the same kind of thing that they were talking about with the SATs and standardized testing, right?
Yeah.
And so, and I'm not entirely familiar. And this is why I like doing this unscripted shit, because I really don't know. But it seems to me that you had school districts, particularly in the States, that you know, if they scored low, they didn't get their budget figures, or they didn't get the bonuses that they would if they scored high. And so the type of test they were delivering and the formatting and all of this shit, which totally, you know, was to the benefit of certain groups, they obviously scored better. And as a result, they got the perks.
Yeah. And teachers were only teaching to test, right? So you weren't actually teaching kids, you know, tangible skills of like creative thinking or, you know, how to solve it. It were just like, okay, here's a question, here's a format. How do I just apply this to it?
Right.
But you also have the issue in the States and here where systemically, again, property taxes in the area fund that school.
Oh.
So if you live in a more affluent neighborhood, you get more funding to that school.
Okay.
So that's pretty systemic.
But I live in now.
Well, but then you get things that feel interesting where you have, you know, there's a West Vancouver school that sponsors an East Vancouver school and gives them some of their property taxes to offset it. But I don't know how, if that's just a charitable thing that they can choose to do, or if that's something that's mandated by the school board or what, but it's.
Well, it would be, yeah, I'm not exactly sure how I feel about that. You know, like it's surprising to me that even at that base kind of provincial education level, we're not just saying this is the pool, these are the amount of schools we have, everybody gets the same, you know, or on a per capita basis.
Yeah.
It's surprising to me. So let's talk about cameras, because I was sitting there the other day, and one of the things that I throw out when I'm doing mediation and I'm talking to people about, you know, change and putting in stuff is that it's great to say you want to do something, but, you know, if there's no accountability, then laws don't matter if there's no cops. So we've got a situation now, and I think it's probably I can't even imagine the exponential growth since the Rodney King thing. But we're seeing in real time multiple instances of people of color and different minority groups, despicable acts being caught on tape. So I asked you about the study that was done. And because it was, in the 6 months of college that I did, I thought this was really cool. But you say it's the Hawthorne effect. What is the Hawthorne effect? And tell me about the study that showed it.
Hawthorne effect's actually probably one of the actual first organizational psychology studies as well. So it's kind of branched us off. But the study is, they wanted to test productivity with employees. So what they did, or they wanted to test whether lighting changed productivity. I should be more specific. But they brought in the new lights and they had people standing there with clipboards, and then they were like, okay, well, people are way more productive than usual, so clearly the lights worked. But then they ended up changing the study, so then they had just the people with clipboards and not the lighting, and they found out it was just being observed that changed people's behavior and not obviously the lighting. So when you think about things like the increased use of cell phones, with video cameras now, that people can actually film people doing things, people are getting held to their actions more, or people are changing their behaviors because people are looking more.
Now, does the fact that they're changing them during observation mean that they're changing them generally? Like if we put body cameras on people, like cops or social workers, because I think social workers should have them too, does that mean that they're just going to dress pretty for the camera?
Yeah, so there's a piece of that where you're getting people to conform, right? So conformity, where you're just following what other people are doing, because of the video camera, because of the societal expectations. And that's, again, what back to our big $5 word is that cognitive dissonance, where it's like, I'm now doing a behavior that I don't necessarily attitudinally believe in. So something's going to change. Either the person's going to get fed up and they're going to outburst, and we're seeing this where cops have known that they're on camera and they're still doing the acts because they're like, well, obviously this isn't as big of a deal as people think it is, or they're trivializing what's actually happening. Or you can actually get the point where people will say, oh, this was actually a bad behavior in the first place, and they adjust their attitude for it. And what goes what way really depends on a lot of different factors. But I think right now what we're seeing, this huge upheaval and protests, and we're seeing that majority of people are supporting the protest rather than not supporting, is that you're going to see that behavior swing and people are going to change their mindset in the right way, even if it's not the best intentions and it's just social pressure or mob mentality. That's fine. That's a sort of a step in the right direction.
So how long does it take? Like if Canada's an organization and you're the consultant coming in, how long do we need to be able to implement these actions, these observational actions, these methods of external accountability? How long before we can think that that's going to take root? Is that something that happens in 2 weeks?
No. Oh, definitely not. They say true behavior change doesn't actually happen until at least 12 to 16 months of just rote. You can change a habit quicker. So you could change, so if it's like, oh, I'm not drinking enough water, it'll take 45 days-ish to change a habit, but to actually have tangible behavior change, it's 12 to 16 months, which is a long time that we're going to have to keep pushing.
And so that kind of goes alongside with classical conditioning, if I'm right?
Yeah,
so
there's a bit.
Pavlov thing?
Yeah, there's a bit of that, and then there's just general, like, your neural networks having to like re-strengthen themselves. And I don't want to get fully into the biology of that, but
well, but I guess the reason I'm asking is because, like, again, 6 months of college. I I know that there's an element of regression when it comes to
Hmm.
that classical conditioning stuff, because it's what we're hoping is that this observation will change dynamics and change behaviors, at least visible ones, so
Right.
that we can start uh, kind of a paradigm shift in society. But I
Hmm.
also know that regression plays a huge part, and there are factors that lend to that. So what are those factors? How do we make it so regression is less likely?
Yeah, we've got to keep reinforcing the behaviors, right? So the minute that you stop reinforcing it, then or the threat of punishment is also gone away, then people are going to start regressing. So a good example of that is, there's all of this protest and everyone was commenting, and we had Blackout Tuesday and people were posting things that are all black just to listen to voices, or writing Black Lives Matter, and having we were paying attention to who weren't doing that, and what companies weren't doing that, what celebrities weren't doing that, and people might have had their own motives why or why not they were not doing that, but it held people accountable, and people were getting reinforced or punished for doing that, right? People were getting likes because they were doing that, or people were getting called out because they weren't doing that. And so having those components are important, but there's other pieces that where it doesn't have to just be external, right? You can have internal motivation, right? You can have that helper's high where you really enjoyed volunteering, or you really enjoyed feeling like you're making a difference and being out there, and you can get out there and you get that own self-fulfilling kind of reinforcement. um, or even just the same thing where it's like if you just feel so awful that you feel like you have to do something to help if you're not doing something, that utilizing that is also important. But
Cool. So in addition to that,
mhm.
because we're talking about hopefully maintaining stuff, I'm seeing a bunch of people that are, I think one of the most disturbing things to me is there are just some very negative reactions
Mhm.
towards and questioning motives of people trying to make change. And
Mhm.
so I think an example would be the NFL, where they put out their statement, and then the NFL players themselves put out a much better statement,
Mhm.
which caused Roger Goodell, to come out and apologize better.
Mhm.
Um, what's more important at this point, positive reinforcement or negative reinforcement? What's going to be better?
Your positive reinforcement's always better. Negative, if you have the threat of punishment, people will naturally go into a defensive fight or flight mode, and people will shut down and stop listening. But if you positively reinforce um, the small negative, like the small little things, people will naturally not stop doing the things that they're not getting reinforced for. So ideally, we would reinforce the NFL for saying like, oh, that was a pretty good statement. Oh, but this person's is even better, but not necessarily saying theirs was bad. Will then help them promote and be like, oh yeah, we're definitely on board. And so they're not defensive, they're still getting praise, but then they're seeing what better even looks like, and they move towards that.
Cool. Well, no, that's very helpful, and I guess my hope that the takeaway from this will be people understand that
Mhm.
there is a real process to this. It's not just light switch,
Yeah.
you know.
No. Yeah.
So
I think.
go ahead.
Sorry. Well, I think that's a big piece too, where a lot of people are, you know, disowning friends and family that are racist, where you could take a different approach where you just listen to them, positively reinforce where they might have something tangibly like in the right direction, but not necessarily disowning them, because that's all that's going to do is create extremism. Whereas if we can bring people even to neutral, that's going to be a better society than creating this, similar to the States where you create very radical Bernie bros versus Trump supporters.
Yeah, and really, I mean, when I look at that, I mean, both are problematic. I mean, it's I think one group's a bigger set of idiots than the other, but I mean, neither group I think is representing their cause well. So
Right.
but I think that brings up an interesting point with what do people do with their anger? How if if you're like me and you've never grown up in a time where there hasn't been some oppression,
Right.
and I was explaining to my kid the other day, I'm 2 generations away from residential school. I mean, my grandpa went, my mom
Mhm.
didn't, I didn't.
Mm.
But every time I talk about my grandfather's experience, it kind of kills me a little bit.
Mm.
And
Yeah.
so if that's the blanket I've been sleeping under,
Mhm.
how do you reconcile that hurt and that anger? What are some of the positive things people can do to help move forward so they can participate in a paradigm shift?
Yeah. And that's a piece, right? Because you don't want people to have learned helplessness, right? Where they feel that it's just you're just getting pummeled by this never changing, never adapting. And you're also seeing the burnout fatigue that people are facing right now, where they're feeling like they need to constantly educate people and help change the movement. So you're seeing some people change that anger into, education and advocacy, but they're burning out from it, right? So it's this is where if they can find, allies to kind of share some of um, that labor with, that's the best thing that you can probably do at this point, because you don't want to dissociate and you don't want to pull away from people. And I mean, you can go some people will go more extreme with their anger to then adjust it, but positive things that I've seen people do is funnel it into screenplays or books or art, or find a way to evoke that emotion into other people and get it out of your system. But it's I don't I it's a hard one.
Yeah, I think it'd be individual to everybody.
Yeah.
But what I hear you saying is that it's important to express that, not just to hide it,
Oh,
not just
yeah,
to
no.
repress it and hope that it comes out some way, because and I'm an old youth worker. You know, we
Um,
we tell kids all the time, anger wins every
mhm,
time. If you don't manage it, it'll manage you.
mhm,
And so finding positive ways to express that, and not just the anger, but the hurt or the betrayal or whatever it is that's causing that anger, but to get
mhm.
that reconciled so that you're not feeling as anger, maybe just more purposed.
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and building. I know a question that a lot of my friends have been talking and saying to each other is to help build the empathy around that anger, right? Where we're talking about what would it actually take for us to go out in a pandemic with a group of people where you're going to get tear gassed, you're going to get arrested. Like, what would it actually take in our personal lives for us to be that angry? Really? So then we can at least try and empathize and be there for them.
Yeah. It's yeah, it's an interesting discussion, and I don't think this will be the last time we talk about it. But as we start to close off, tell the people what you do. It's because I think you're awesome, and I think people should. Well, no, I do. I mean, I heard you speak a couple of times. You've always had a good thing to say. What
Mhm.
type of work? Like, if people actually need some help, what type of
Mhm.
stuff do you actually help with?
Yeah, so organizational psychology, so a lot of kind of strategic HR type work. So I don't have to do any of the sad stuff of, firing or layoffs, but I get to do the fun, like coaching, developing people for improvement, um, or doing the psychology testing to see who's ready for that next promotion and how do we get them there if they're not there ready yet. So um, kind of a nice, more positive side to psychology.
Cool. And they can reach you how?
I'm at Triple Threat Consulting is my business. I've got a website. I've got Twitter. I've got um, email triple threat consult florco at triplethreatconsulting.ca if you need to email me.
Perfect. And so, as we close off, I'm going to ask you, what's an organization that maybe people don't know about that they should know more about? Is there any particular causes or groups
Mm.
that you think are awesome that people should check out?
Um, lately, I've been big on Water First. So it's mainly an Ontario charity that is promoting, to get rid of boil advisories and, um, you know, tainted water in Ontario First Nations communities.
Great. Well, people can check them out.
Hmm.
So we're going to say goodbye, but I thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it. Please don't send me a bill. And it's, as always, it's been lovely talking to you. Say hi to your brother for me,
Yeah,
and go Gators.
perfect. Thanks.
All right.